There was one purpose to build what became the Eastern Kentucky Division of the L&N, and that was to get to the coal on the North Fork of the Kentucky River. They made several early attempts to do that, mostly through acquisition of earlier lines like the Riney B, the Lexington and Eastern, different railroads that didn't quite get there. They got as far, in most cases, as Jackson. But the real good stuff, the really high value coal, was further to the east, or actually southeast, along the North Fork of the Kentucky. So the L&N acquired what was left of those other lines, eventually abandoned most of them, and built their own new line all the way from Patio, which is Winchester, all the way to the end of the track around McRoberts or Neon in Letcher County, Kentucky. It was a very high level, heavy haul branch line. It went to the middle of nowhere and literally stopped. It went to where the last mining production was, and built up a tremendous amount of coal production from probably, in its heyday, 50, 60, 70 different mines that were served by, fleets of mine runs with 282s. And they gathered all this coal at various spots and started moving it north through the terminal at Hazard, which had been formed, I think it was populated around 1824. But even by the time it became a county seat in 1884, the only way you could get there was either to float in on the river, or it took a 2-day trip across the mountains to get to Hazard. So when the railroad reached that end, or that area of Eastern Kentucky, it was the transportation. And that's the way it was, even though it was primarily handling coal. Hauled a lot of passengers, a lot of general freight, everything that had to be consumed, whether it be food or other consumable items, automobiles, furniture, you name it, clothing, came in by train. Of course, that all changed as in subsequent years as the highway network improved, and that took a long time to develop. But that was the EK's function, and it was its own division. Not only did it extend from Patio to the end, but there was also the stretch that ran under its jurisdiction from north of Winchester at North Cabin over to Lexington, and Lexington down through Frankfort, and Frankfort to Anchorage at HK Tower. That was all part of the EK's jurisdiction as well. It was the smallest, it was next to the smallest division on the railroad. CV was actually smaller, but it was strategically important. You got to remember that back in the day, for every dollar the L&N took in, 50 cents of it came from coal revenue. So when you look at the share that came off the EK and the Cumberland Valley Division, and then some in Alabama and some in Western Kentucky, that was pretty important to the shareholders. That's why the L&N was always solvent. They even paid dividends through the Depression, except for 1 year. And that's pretty solid when you consider Southern Railway was nearly in receivership there a couple times. So it was always a well-managed operation, very conservative. No, the original line went all the way to a terminal at Neon. What they built after the end of World War II was largely on the optimism that coal was really going to take off in the post-war boom. That was what prompted them to purchase 22 more M1 284s. That's what prompted them to try their first 5 F3 diesels to use in pusher service. And a number of branch lines. The Rockhouse Creek branch, for instance, was extended all the way to Dean, where it was within sight of, but didn't connect with the C&O line. And a lot of new mines propped up. They even built a new yard at a place, it's Cornettsville, but it was called Dent Yard. They had a brand new, in 1950, understand, it's 1950, that was, you know, that was a pinnacle year, because in that same year the L&N committed to dieselization. So at Dent they built a 100-ton coaling tower, coaling facility, sanding facility, yard, all this stuff. They dumped a lot of money into that. So most of the new mine development, the Leatherwood Creek branch, all that was built after the war. So you had like a plethora of mines that were coming online, and they fed tonnage out the north end, which was the only way out, at a level you just wouldn't believe. It was incredible. Coal trains during the M1 era, coal trains could handle 9,500 tons. So you can do the math. A 50-ton loaded hopper was 73 tons. So you could do the math and see how many that is. But a single M1 would handle that, except for the shove over Elkatawa Hill, which locally is Elkatoy. Every place has a local pronunciation, which would always be the official. So Elkatawa Hill is Elkatoy Hill. And then when they would get to the big yard at Ravenna, those trains would be consolidated and inspected, recrewed, and crews would be called out of there to take the trains on up to Patio and then downriver from Winchester to DeCourcy, the big yard at DeCourcy, south of Cincinnati. So it was a conveyor belt of coal. It was a boring railroad in terms of operation because it was well engineered and was all downriver. It was engineered so that coal would move downstream on the North Fork of the Kentucky River, except across Elkatoy Hill. And on the new route that the L&N built, I think around 1915, from Ravenna up to Patio, which was a low-grade line. And I can't remember the grade, but it wasn't substantial. They did use pushers, but they could make good time on it. So it was, in terms of gradient, it was kind of dull and uninteresting. You know, if you're moving coal loads, of course it was perfect from an engineering, you know, corporate standpoint, operationals. If you operate in the steam era, if you had an M1 that started with, let's say 9,500 tons out of Neon, literally all the engineer would do would be to, you know, kick off the brake, drop the reverser down into the corner, you know, maybe kick the booster on, get the train rolling. And from there on, it was either level or slightly downriver. So, you know, the only challenge was the rolling resistance from all those cars. You may have, you know, 140, 150 cars back there. Well, as they go through, you know, reverse curves of, you know, 8, 10 degrees back and forth, all that builds up to a lot of resistance. So you had to work steam through those curves, but it wasn't like going up a, you know, 1.5% grade. So it took a lot of skill to move that tonnage downstream, but it got easier because it was well engineered. The grade across Elkatoy, which was out of Gentry, just north of Jackson, was built because they had to avoid a really circuitous route the river took to the north that would have cost an arm and a leg to build, and would cost a lot more time in terms of transport time. So they chose to build across that little watershed divide to get to the other side. They were always either on the North Fork of the Kentucky River or a tributary. But this was a change in one of those small watershed divides. They went up that creek, I think it's called Elkatoy Creek, and then to the other side. In the post-war era, they took a serious look at rerouting or some way reducing the grade. According to John Tilford, who would later become president of the L&N, it was going to be around $15 million, and they said that was just prohibitive. They couldn't swallow that. So they looked for other alternatives. The other alternative was the F3 Black Cat diesels. And in doing that and making that kind of commitment, it was also to get their toe in the water of diesel electric power for freight service. They were happy with the E6s they'd used in passenger service since 1942, but hadn't tried freight units. They had a lot of yard engines as well. But the hill at that time needed two 282s around the clock. So you had 2 engine crews shoving coal trains over the mountain. So they were able in one move there to eliminate 1 engine crew. So that's already a savings. And so with 3 or 4 F3s and an M1 on the point, they were able to handle 9,500 tons. So that became more cost effective than trying to reroute everything. I'm sure, all things being equal, they would have probably liked to have an easier route over the hill or a different, easier grade. But in some cases you have no alternative. Geography wins and you just have to deal with it. If you have to deal with a gradient that's there, you can either go under it, that's not practical. You can go over it at the expense of a lot more track that coils up one side and coils down the other side. Or you can just say, this is really bad, let's just go up and over it and keep a pusher engine here. And that's what they did. And you see that kind of scenario a lot in American railroading in places where they had to deal with grades. You just live with it and it becomes a pusher district. And so those are the realities. Jackson became a very strategically important place because of the pusher service. They had a nice brick depot, a substantial freight station. They had a pedestrian overpass. It was a pretty substantial investment of L&N money in Jackson, and it was an important place. Initially, the helpers weren't based there. They were based at Gentry, about 2 miles past, just outside of O&K Junction. O&K Junction Tunnel. But Jackson was always the maintenance base, so when engines need to be serviced, they came to Jackson. They'd get coal, water, whatever they needed. When the diesels came, that became the maintenance base, and they kept a diesel technician at Jackson. Anytime they had a problem with one of those F3s, it was all new motive power to those guys, and they said, smoke's coming from a wrong place, we're coming in. And so they would take them into Jackson and service those things. And that's where they were fueled and sanded. And also they had a coaling station there at Jackson, so the through trains that were going north stopped and took coal, water before they hit the hill. So Jackson was a pretty important place. The first time I ever visited Jackson was in the mid-60s, and because, I didn't have the kind of mobility. I was a teenager, and you just couldn't say, well, I'm going to Jackson, Kentucky, particularly in those days, because the highway network was so bad, you had to have enormous desire to go somewhere. It's like Elkhorn City, Kentucky. I'm going to Elkhorn City, Kentucky. Why? Why would you weren't born there, why do you need to be there? Because it was an ordeal to go places, and it was, this was the nature of the Appalachian region. It was really a region apart from the mainstream of America, mostly because of a sense of isolation. Some places were better than others, but some places were like incredibly isolated. Jackson was a great community. In the mid-60s, it had a thriving business district. I remember getting a grilled cheese sandwich at a little dinette. It was great. By that time, they'd moved the helper back to Jackson instead of Gentry, and they had 3 F units assigned there that day, an F9 and a rebuilt F2 and an F7. L&N's diesel fleet was kind of like a Frankenstein creations, a little of this and a little of that. But I stayed there long enough to catch 3 coal trains going up the hill and 1 empty train coming down, and I thought, man, I got to get back here. And then life intervened, and it was a few years before I got back over there. But it continued to be a hot place for activity. All trains, unless they were a local or a mine run, got shoved. In some cases, if empty trains were of sufficient length, the helpers would go across the hill and pull them up the other side, because that was a grade as well. There are grades on either side. When the M1s were new on the EK, if they had an empty drag of anything other than 100, if they had 140 empty cars, that was more than an M1 could drag up the north side of Elkatoy Hill. So the helpers would have to go across and hook to the front of them and pull them across the top, even though it was empties, because it was just above the tonnage rating. If it were 110 cars, the M1 should make it, but 140, got to be helped. So they did, these are things that we learned when we were researching the book, and we looked at lots of correspondence in the L&N test department, and just lots of little nuggets of information that said, this is good stuff, we need to make a book. Well, actually there were two hazards. There was hazard proper, and then there was north hazard, which was the yard. They were, you know, like together, but north hazard was the yard, and it was really cramped. It's a very narrow valley. Just wasn't much real estate there to build a railroad, and so consequently they had to build an auxiliary yard to the north of there at Crawford, just to handle, you know, empties and loads. Within hazard, you had full service. You had a 100-foot turntable that was strengthened to handle the M1s. They had a 9-stall roundhouse, and they had a full-size concrete coaling station. They had all the necessary accoutrements to support steam power in its glory. And I think they did heavy repairs. They didn't do total rebuilds, but they did heavy repairs on steam locomotives in the roundhouse with their own forces. And that was important because it was isolated. And if you had a locomotive that was down, you know, you didn't really have the luxury of having it limp all the way to South Louisville. So these guys managed on their own. So they had a skilled team of machinists, mechanics, pipe fitters, boiler makers, welders, electricians, you name it. That's in the steam era. Even in the dieselization, though, they reduced the size of the roundhouse a little bit, but it continued to be a major terminal. So you could, you know, my first visit to Hazard, I mean, it was teeming with locomotives and very diverse. You had RS3s, Alco cab units. By that time, they had 6-motor units, so you had SD35s, U25Cs, and those big Alcos, C628s, C630s. It was just a magical place, you know, and it was, the only way you could get to the yard was a footbridge that walked there. You couldn't get a vehicle in there. So the footbridge was at the south end of the yard. It was a suspension bridge, but it was of more substantial construction than some of the little flimsy things you used to see. But Hazard was a hopping place for the L&N. Ravenna was created out of just basically a sense of need. The L&N had all this coal coming from all those mines, going all the way back to Neon and through Dent and, well, that area, and Hazard, Jackson, all that. So it gets funneled up to there. And that's the place where that's where they had to rebuild these trains to take them to DeCourcy. They would add tonnage. Every car would get doped. You'd have to have car inspectors to go through. Every car had solid bearings, so you'd have to have car inspectors to flip up the lids on all the journal boxes, check to make sure the oil in the pads were full, otherwise you'd have a hot box. So all the trains had to be doped, as they called it, and they were reblocked at Ravenna. So you had active yard crew. This is a time when you didn't have unit trains. It was a loose car, so every car was going to a different place. You may have a block of cars to go, but you had multiple cars going different markets in the Midwest. Most of it, almost all going to the Midwest for home heating, industrial use, steel making, you name it. Coal was, so it was all funneled up through DeCourcy. Much later, as the market for thermal coal for power plants in the Southeast picked up, a lot of that coal started going south. But that's the nature of how the coal business has been over its life cycle. You know, the markets have always changed with respect to what the needs are. and it's evolved to that, there's a big demand for metallurgical coal now. I digress, but anyway, that was Ravenna's function. So it was division headquarters. You had the dispatchers there. Actually, you had two sets of dispatchers initially, and you had a roundhouse, fairly large roundhouse, large 120 foot turn, 120 foot diameter turntable, concrete coaling station. It's the same facilities you would find Hazard. It's a lot more spacious because by the time you get to Ravenna, the geography has changed quite a bit. It's a lot more wide open. So they had a large yard for that reason. And so coal trains were put together and shipped north, and they would have a helper engine behind the caboose that would cut off at patio. Usually it would be an M1, but a lot of times it would be a J4 282. We've got some photos of J4 shoving coal trains out of Ravenna. And of course, there was passenger train service on the EK as well. So we have some shot. We've found a shot of an L1 482 on the passenger local stopped at Ravenna, and we said, "What's an L1 doing on the EK?" And I said, "Well, there it is." So they used 482s, and they ran at that time. They were running all the way to Neon. So just so many things you didn't know. One of the things we've learned, unfortunately, is there is a dearth of steam era photography on the EK south of Ravenna. A lot of out-of-town photographers that were somewhat notable of that era would come down and cover Ford to patio on the KY. They covered that a lot, and they covered quite a bit between patio and Ravenna, including Ravenna. But once you got past the south yard limit board at Ravenna, nothing. It was difficult to access, and still is, by highway. You just have to run into a place and maybe hope you catch a train and not. And they just didn't go there. I've learned through many years of looking through L&N photography files that the company photographers wanted to sleep in their own bed in Louisville. So they were tethered to home, so they didn't want to go end up in a place like Hazard, because they couldn't get back home in time to go to their home and sleep in their own bed. So unless they were sent out on special assignment, you just didn't see that. So even going through the L&N corporate files, photography files, very little. Then the other thing is the out-of-town photographers, they got all the easy pickings. They cherry-picked the stuff on the KY, the places I mentioned, and they didn't get there. So we have exactly 3 photos of an M1 south of Ravenna. One is an engine turned over on its side at Talega. One is on the turntable at Dent, and one is a tender shot in the yard at Neon, which is the very end of the line. That's it. We have a few other steam shots, but even those are pretty rare. So we have done everything imaginable to try to flush these things out. My theory is that there were, what's the term, the Center for Railroad Photography and Art, the vernacular photos, just the everyday snap shooters. I'm sure folks took photos of locomotives and things, but over the years, these are family albums. They've been lost. They've been, they may have been destroyed in a flood, but if they're still out there, where do you look for them? You can't find them. So we've gone through the local historical societies and just hadn't had any luck. However, we've tried to, in my writing, I've tried to visualize all that and capture all that, if not in picture, at least in words, because we know how they operated. We know the operating circumstances. We know the tonnages. We know how the locomotive works. We know the train sizes. We know the territory, and so we've tried to talk our way through that to help fill the void. And we've picked up a few anecdotes from employees that were interviewed 60 or 70 years ago. And so these are literally voices from the grave. Because I was 9 years old when the L&N officially dieselized, and I'm 76 now. my first-hand experiences with the M1s and the steamer as a youngster, pretty vivid, but I couldn't really tell you what cutoff position to use on an M1 if you were on a 1% grade with, 6,000 tons. I wasn't there. But oddly enough, while we're not talking about the CV, a photographer named Johnny Krause covered the CV quite well, all the way up to Lynch. So we've got a good selection of M1 stuff on the CV, which is to my delight. But it just also makes me sad because we don't have enough on the EK. Well, toward the end of steam, there was this initiative to build what would become the Kentucky Railway Museum in Louisville, and of course they needed a lot of money. And so together they came up with this fundraising idea to run an excursion with one of the 4 passenger M1s from Cincinnati to Ravenna and back. And the engine they selected and dolled up and repainted and fixed up was number 1962. And so all the rail fans from the Louisville area, a lot of them rode up that morning on extra coaches they had on the rear of number 6, the Hummingbird. So we've got some slides taken by Jack Fravert that show the Hummingbird coming into Cincinnati to CUT, and you can see the smoke rising from 1962. So he's got slides of them putting the extra flags on it and everything. There was still other steam at CUT. The B&O was still using steam, and the New York Central, and of course the N&W. But the L&N hadn't used steam in a long time. So the excursion was limited to 30 miles an hour because they had a gondola and a caboose on the rear, so people could have an open air experience. This was in a more innocent time. They had an extended stop on the way south at DeCourcy where people could just get out, and there were shots of them crawling all over these stored locomotives. People have a coronary if they saw the safety issues back then, but it was a more innocent time. So they eventually got to Ravenna. They had another stop at Falmouth going south, photo stop. They got the engine turned, everything, a lot more. And they decided to have a photo run by at Red River Viaduct, and it was apparently incredible. But they also realized they'd lost a lot of time, so they left the caboose and the gon behind at Ravenna and authorized the engineer to run passenger speed back to Cincinnati. So when they got to Winchester, it was hammered down. And I talked to Charlie Kastner. He had gotten on the train southbound at Cynthiana, so he got back off at Cynthiana. He said, wow, he said, what an experience. He said, all the vestibule doors, Dutch doors were open. He said, we were just getting beat to death with cinders, and said it was just amazing. I said, how fast you going? He said, I don't know, plenty fast. Passenger train speed was authorized at 70. An M1 could make 100 miles an hour, and did in test. So they didn't hit 100 miles an hour, but they certainly got way up in the passenger train speed. The 1962, as all the engines, all the M1s ultimately got scrapped. There are all kinds of urban myths about what happened. The L&N was not particularly benevolent when it came to donating things. Some railroads were, like the C&O. Some weren't. Like the New York Central didn't see fit to save a single Hudson. Union Pacific was, Southern Pacific was, you could take it real, but the L&N was very conservative. They saved 152 because it was chosen by President Tilford. He remembered that engine when he was a younger person on the L&N, used to work the south end of the railroad. And so they set it aside years before KRM was complete. The other 2 engines that survived, 2132 now at Corbin, and 2152 at KRM. Those were both sold to other firms and thus were saved secondarily. So it wasn't because of anything the L&N did. So why didn't they save an M1? It's a little of both. The L&N was not inclined to make an outright donation of an engine that had a scrap value at that time of around $8,000. That's not including the tender. They didn't want to sell any of the tenders. The tenders got repurposed for auxiliary fuel tenders, maintenance way work. Just about all of them did. Hung around for a long time. Some of them are still being used as auxiliary tenders behind some excursion era stuff. And I think there's one at Ravenna. So, but the locomotives, they represented a scrap value of nearly $8,000. And at that time, the KRM made some mild overtures, and it kind of got, well, if you guys want to come up with $8,000, we can talk. Well, that was an enormous amount of money, and so nothing really happened. So the LN was not inclined to donate, and KRM was in its infancy, and they had all they could deal with just trying to get 152 out to that first side at River Road, and it didn't happen. What's not really known is that those M1s hung around until 1959. They were scrapped just outside of Cincinnati, and we've got, unfortunately, color slides of them being cut up in June 1959. And in some of those same slides, you can see C&O H8 2666's Alleghenies being cut up, some B&O steam, some Norfolk and Western 482s. It was a scrapyard just west of downtown Cincinnati, along the river there, where the B&O and the New York Central ran. So it didn't happen. During the discussions for the book, Charlie Bacola and I said, "Gee, Charlie," I said, "we'd have to adjust for inflation, but I said, if we could go back in time, don't you think we could come up with the cash to get one?" He said, "Yeah, I think we'd do that." He said, "I don't know what we'd do with it," but he said we could have possibly saved it. 2716, it was donated by the C&O because they asked. KRM asked, Charlie Kastner was involved, and the C&O was just far more generous. They had it, and they said, "Sure, here it is." And they donated it to KRM. They took it across that little spindly trestle over Beargrass Creek in the original KRM site, and it still exists, just because they asked and the C&O was generous. The L&N was not so generous.
Thank God for generosity.
Yes. Well, you know, it's you can brush that off and say, well, the railroad was insensitive to its heritage, it was indifferent about its legacy, was just cold hard numbers, and there's a grain of truth in all that. Within certain levels of management within the L&N at that time, they would have been happy to donate it an M1, but it wasn't their call. So it never rose to the point of importance at upper management that anyone pulled the trigger on it. And so those engines, they remained in storage for a long time at Ravenna, some at Latonia and Covington, and then bit by bit they started taking them over to Cincinnati and cutting them up. And that's how they turned it into cash so they could make payments on new diesels. When they spec'd out the first 14 Baldwin engines in 1942, they actually specified that they could all be potentially outfitted for passenger service. To do that, you needed a steam line that ran out of the boiler and obviously under the tender, and had a steam line connection for heat and air conditioning, steam ejector air conditioning. And there's an air signal line that has a whistle above a little air whistle above the engineer. That was how they communicated with the engine. The conductor would communicate with the engineer on where to stop, when to go. There were signals in the rule book like turn up the heat. And there were all kinds of little whistle signals that were communicated by that little airline. So you could make out a passenger M1 because it had an extra air hose. It was a little smaller in diameter, but so you had two air hoses and then the steam coupling. But that was basically it. They were just otherwise stock engines, just like everything else. They were used primarily between Cincinnati and Corbin on trains like the Southland and the Flamingo, which was the night train. Around 46 or 47, the L&N was breaking the Southland down into two sections. The diesels would take the coach section, which would be number 33, and you'd have a couple of E units and head-end cars and coaches and a diner. And number 35 was the all-Pullman section, which would be pulled by an M1. So for a time, you had the M1 on an all-Pullman train, the Southland, second section of the Southland. They were used on Kentucky Derby Special several times, sometimes down to Louisville on troop trains. Occasionally would catch one of the locals, local passenger trains. The L&N had a local until about 1950 that ran down out of Cincinnati to Paris, and then took the Paris and Lexington branch, which was really a light rail route that ran to Lexington and looped around and then came back out at North Cabin at Winchester. So it made a kind of a little dog leg to serve Lexington. So we found out in our research through one of this guy Chick Giesland, who was a really helpful guy, who was a KY engineer and a fireman, and we found it in the Charlie's research from back 60 years ago. He said that they caught that train. He said it was number 31, came out of Cincinnati and had an M1 on it, and they got to Paris. He said I was the engineer, and I got down and walked during the passenger stop and got to our conductor, and I said, "Hey, Cap," said, "listen, buddy," he said, "this engine's not authorized to go over the branch to Lexington." He said, "I tell you what, Chick," she said, "you get back up on that engine." He said, "The L&N Railroad down there in Louisville, they know what they're doing. They gave us this engine up there at CUT and meant for us to go to Lexington, said, let's highball, let's get out of here." He said, "Okay." So he said, I got back on, I said, "Hold on." And so we made it to Lexington and then turned around, came through, made the stop at Lexington and back out at North Cabin without incident. So an M1 made it to Lexington, Kentucky and back. But it wasn't planned to be that way, because that route was not authorized for an M1.
I love stories like that.
Yeah, I wish, don't you wish you had a photo of that? But we found all these gems and, boxes of notes and correspondence, and it was amazing. It was amazing. Southeast Coal was a very old corporation, and had been around for a long time. Most of their operations were up on the far end, or the south end of the EK. They managed to get a very lucrative contract with Kentucky Utilities to serve them with coal, and they ended up getting a preferred rate from the L&N, because the L&N was having a hard time finding enough coal hoppers and locomotives to handle the glut of traffic that was coming their way. And you really can't blame the L&N, because how many cars do you have to have in the fleet to cover X amount of coal traffic that may be here today but not be here 2 years from now? So you may end up with a lot of stored cars. So they incentivized these rates to companies like Southeast, and they took advantage of it and said, we'll buy our own locomotives. So they bought some D-turbo GP20s and some new GP38-2s, I think. And so they had a prep plant which basically separates all the non-coal stuff at Calla. So the raw coal trains would start from their mines up around Ison, Kentucky, and come through with L&N crews and go all the way to Calla, and then the coal would be processed and reloaded and then taken to Kentucky Utilities. It was a very lucrative operation. A good attorney friend of mine, Steve Kaywood at Pineville, said that when Kentucky Utilities brought suit against Southeast to try to terminate that contract, he said it was a legal travesty. He said it was politicized and a legal travesty, but he said they had an ironclad contract, but he said under a lot of pressure, Southeast would end up losing that business, because they realized they'd signed a contract with Southeast and paying a premium price, and they could get the coal off the spot market a lot cheaper. So they got out of the contract, but he said from a legal standpoint, it was a travesty. And of course, that was the end of Southeast Coal. So I don't, what was the name of the family? Levere's?
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I just can't think of the name.
I can't remember. I'd need Robbie's notes, but I can tell you that the demise of Southeast Coal was really bad. The guy that owned the company was a very benevolent guy, and behind the scenes was very opposed to surface mining and the degradation of the environment in eastern Kentucky. Most of their operations were deep mines. And so he would silently pass along some money to some of those who were trying to beat back some of the, the worst of the surface mine work that really destroyed the environment in eastern Kentucky. So, all coal mining is not, environmentally irresponsible. This guy really loved the region and gave back to it. So I think that was one of the sadder stories of the EK, was the loss of Southeast Coal.
And about when, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No.
About when were, I guess 70s and 80s is the era?
When that happened, let's see, 86, probably is after the it's probably 89, 90, because I photographed Southeast Coal over there 86, 87. Their locomotives were painted black by that time, but the mint green was earlier. Yeah.
We have a big, I assume it came from Cala, this huge metal sign.
Yeah.
From Southeast Coal. It's probably about taller than you. It's
yeah.
huge. But okay, well that's good, because I was always curious of why were they running on the LNN and CSX, and it just kind of
why they had their own locomotives.
Yeah, I just had never, no one had ever told me why.
Well, they went to the LNN and said, look, we'll take the monkey off your back. We'll provide our own locomotives built to your specs. We'll provide our own cars to your specs. And you give us a cut on the rate because you don't have to provide those things, and just give us your track, your crews, you operate it as your train. The LNN said, that's great, we'll do it.
It's cool. And Oneida and Western was like that.
Same thing. Shamrock Coal, they went and they said we'd like to do this. And the LNN by that time wised up, because they didn't have to make the capital investment. They didn't have to buy the locomotives, they didn't have to expand their car fleet, they didn't have to worry about any of that stuff. And I imagine they had an arrangement, I'm sure they had an arrangement with the LNN to do general maintenance on the cars and locomotives, fuel, sand, that sort of thing. It was a good deal for both parties. The idea was that the EK's coal producers, most of their markets were in the Southeast, in the Carolinas and Florida. And so up to that point, as that coal was being generated, it had to go out the old way up to Patio and go around the south leg of the Y and go down through Corbin. But Corbin was already getting a lot of traffic off the CV, and it was increasingly going south. And south of Corbin on the Knoxville, the old Knoxville Atlanta division, it just wasn't built for that kind of traffic. The sidings, it just wasn't built to take that kind of traffic. It's just too much. I remember that at Corbin in '78, we were in the dispatcher center there. They had three different dispatcher desks for the Corbin division. And I remember the dispatcher telling me that, he said, if we get more than 13 trains between Corbin and Knoxville, that's when we start to get in trouble. When you start thinking about that, man, that's hard to juggle. You've got a mix of coal trains, empty trains, general merchandise trains, intermodal trains, locals, mine runs. It's crazy. So one of the first things that came from CSX merger was a physical connection at Dean. It was one of the first tangible things that happened, and that became the EK's back door. So some of its traffic immediately started going over the back door across the CNO's Elkhorn and Beaver Valley subdivision down to Beaver Junction, and then they would have to run around the train and go south through Shelby and down to Clinchville. This took a lot of pressure off the LNN, but also gave the Clinchville a glut of traffic. There was, for a time there, the Clinchville was easily seeing 24, 25, 26 total trains a day on most of its line segments. And you think about that, it's a train every hour. On a single track railroad through the mountains, man, something goes wrong, and it's chaos. And railroading is always, it's always an operation that's waiting to go wrong. And so it was chaos. So that was one of the first things. And then of course chassis was able to get a lot of their traffic south to these new markets, to these power plants that they couldn't reach before, except to hand off to another railroad. So it became all part of the same corporation. The downside for the EK was that this diminished the amount of traffic that was going north of the old route through Ravenna, and it continued to go into decline, particularly as some of the northern markets continued into decline. Ravenna became less of an important place, and finally it just wasn't an important place at all. It was a storage yard, and so you could see the trend. The trend line was it was not going to weather the storm. And so you fast forward today, so the coal production that remains on the EK goes out the back door. It goes through Dean. There's not a lot of it, but it still goes, what production goes out that way. And it has now been several years since any train operated through Jackson, Beattyville, Ravenna, and out that way to Patio. In terms of coal tonnage, there have been some movements of stored cars and things like that. It's the legacy of an ironically a dead-end railroad that, when it found its back door, brought about the demise of the rest of it, and that's kind of what happened. That and the decline, the precipitous decline of thermal coal, which you can attribute to a host of factors: economic, environmental pushes. You name it. It's just a perfect storm of bad. In the same way that the decline of coal for home heating and industrial uses in the 50s impacted the coal industry. So is coal dead in eastern Kentucky? I do not think so. I think it's a valuable resource, and I see I don't think it's going to be as robust as there was in the past, but it's still going to be around for a long time. Not long ago, I was able to review how the railroad looks these days south of Ravenna down toward Hazard. It was staggering to see how much the property had degraded from the days when it was still an active line. Slope failures, cuts that have fallen in, rock slide trees down everywhere, vegetation. It was terrible. I mean, it will cost a fortune to put it back into a level where it was once, a heavy haul main line. It's there somewhere under all that debris, and it's rotting and rusting away. But you talk about how quickly Mother Nature can reclaim itself. It's insane. It's insane. And of course, nothing's being done to save it now. And the longer it stays there, the worse it gets, and the more expensive it will be to fix it. Coal is a non-renewable resource, so it's like human life and life itself. It's finite, and so there's a sunset out there somewhere. I didn't think I would see it to the degree I have in my life, but I have, and it's staggering. Most of the bridges on the EK are in good shape unless the footings have deteriorated. But long ago, railroad companies realized that they, if did anything, they over-maintained bridges. They used to go in and chip the rust off and paint them with metal preservative and repaint them silver. And they found that, if we don't do anything to them, they'll still be structurally sound 100 years from now. So the bridges should be in great shape. You don't want to go like that forever, but they need to be cared for because, like anything else, they'll eventually deteriorate and collapse. But most of the bridges were built for the long haul. I think there are 3 major bridges between Ravenna and Patio, and that including Red River Viaduct, and it was the tallest and the most substantial structure on the L&N system. And those things are a bear to maintain. I don't know when they've been they've been inspected for structural integrity, but they need to be, and if there's anything deficient in them, it needs to be dealt with. But there's certainly no replacing them. They have to be kept up to standard. My suspicion is they're going to look a lot worse than they actually are, but they still need attention. When you have such a catastrophic economic change like has happened in eastern Kentucky along the EK, and you're trying to think, how did we go forward from here? You have to really wipe the slate clean and say, what do we do here from this point forward? What assets do we have, and how can we deploy those assets in the future if we're going to even keep these assets? Well, a railroad is a key asset. It was built for one purpose, but it's still there and it can be used for other purposes. There are any number of things you can do economically, and sometimes you can do that juxtaposed with tourism. Certainly there's the attraction of running excursions on an active railroad operation. That's something that's taken place all over the country in the preservation movement, and there's no better place to do it than along the EK, and then particularly in and around Ravenna. It's made to order. It's close enough to major corridors and population centers. It could be a great draw. That's been proven time and time again. But at the same time, you might be able to develop the railroad for other purposes. There's a lot of developable real estate along that route, particularly as you go south toward Ravenna. Things that could be built that would be rail intensive, that you could use that rail route. You're not going to run double stack container trains over it. You're not going to run, high speed passenger rail. That's not necessary, but you can certainly make it a very viable large branch line serving two purposes, offering excursions as well as a business model that allows it to serve some key rail serve businesses. That's something the Kentucky economic development folks need to be focused with CSX and with Kentucky Steam and the others. You have to do new things and look at things differently. I hate to say paradigm, but you have to wipe away the old paradigm and say, let's think about this completely differently. We have this railroad, and it's going to be really sad and stupid if we just send the rail train up there and rip it up, and we've got a long linear piece of real estate that really has no value after that. What are we going to do with it while we still have these tracks here? Let's see what we can do. The Cincinnati Southern, as it was called, was actually built and financed by the city of Cincinnati. And it's got a long, convoluted history about it, and it didn't always involve Southern Railway. The Baltimore and Ohio had a piece of the action there for many years until years later Southern bought their interest out. But the reason it was built is because the people in Cincinnati, the city leaders, thought Louisville is going to eat our lunch because they're further south on the Ohio River, and the L&N was building a line started around 1850 from Louisville south to Nashville. And so with a rail line, they were going to be able to reach some markets and cut short a lot of what Cincinnati could do. So they were absolutely convinced we've got to get south through the mountains of Kentucky and Tennessee and get to Chattanooga and on to Atlanta. We've got to set up a corridor to do that. And seeing no viable option in the private sector, they decided to do it as we'll call it a soft socialism model. So they built it themselves, not intending to run it, but to basically build the infrastructure and then find an operator. And that's what they did. And they selected the Cincinnati, New Orleans, and Texas Pacific, which pretty quickly became a part of Southern Railway. So when you talked about the Cincinnati Southern, that was the physical owner of the route. although that's in a state of change right now. The C&O and TP was the operator, and then of course that was a subsidiary of Southern Railway. It was a tough railroad to build because it ran kind of cross drainage, which, you know, there wasn't a convenient waterway to follow. A lot of tunnels, a lot of bridges, a lot of tough territory, particularly south of Danville and down to Oakdale, Tennessee. And the construction standards were pretty limited at the time, so the tunnels were not built to a standard that would really accommodate a very large piece of equipment, locomotive cars or otherwise. And once you've committed to build tunnels of a certain size, and you got a lot of them, it's not easy to go back and say, we'll just build these tunnels a little bit larger, particularly when you got some that are, you know, nearly a mile long, like at Kings Mountain. And so as time went on, the C&O and TP became a very strategic route for Southern Railway. Actually, for the system, had more ton miles, more traffic, freight traffic than any other segment on the railroad. But it was very confined, and as cars got larger, you know, this is well before high cube box cars or anything like that, even tri-levels, you could see that stuff coming, but the C&O and TP couldn't handle it. So under the Brosnan administration, when he was president of Southern, they made this big commitment. We went back to the city of Cincinnati and said, look, we're going to, if you'll issue these bonds, we've been systematically trying to improve clearances on the rat hole, as it was known, over the years, but we still got some real bad choke points. And so they selected those particular choke points and dropped a ton of money, millions of dollars, into some major line changes. The most significant to me was the one between Tateville and KD Tower, which completely bypassed Alpine Hill, which had some really tight tunnels. And not only did they bypass the tunnels with these deep cuts, but they reduced the gradient. And by doing that, you know, you could handle more tonnage. They did major work down around Nemo, redid some tunnels, bypassed some old tunnels there, did some work immediately south of Oakdale on a couple of tunnels there. And then Kings Mountain was another major project where they bypassed that long tunnel at Kings Mountain, where the C&O and TP really got started there at Kings Mountain. In doing so, it transformed the railroad instantly. So the next day, literally, when they opened up all these line changes, they had no clearance restrictions at all. The very few tunnels that remained were enormous. They were designed to be enormous, even in anticipation that maybe one day you might install catenary and use electric locomotives. That never happened, but the tunnels are enormous. So you have a railroad from Cincinnati to Chattanooga that has zero clearance restrictions. Now, if you go to the east along the former L&N, they had a lot of tunnels as well, and they chiseled them out and bypassed a few and daylighted a few others, but they never could handle very much in terms of they couldn't handle double stacks, anything like that. So they were always at a disadvantage compared to the Southern. So it was a big project, but it was when they first opened, they said it's a high, wide, and handsome railroad. No more rat hole. New River Bridge was from Helenwood down and went down to New River, the community of New River, and crossed a rather substantial bridge, and then came out the other side to Robbins. And most of the railroad was double track back in the day, so you had double track that ran down both sides, went into single track across the bridge, and then came out the other side. Well, under this relocation project and these line changes, Southern had the audacity to build this New River Bridge, which was around 300 feet tall, and it literally, well, it's 300 feet tall. It's the same, about the same height as High Bridge, which is north of Danville. That was the That was the biggest bridge, tallest bridge on the railroad, and that one dated back to the earliest stages of the CNOTP. But to make the bridge at New River, basically they just stuck to the mountaintop, and when they reached the valley, they jumped from one mountaintop to the next. You can't appreciate it unless you're on a train. And the first time I rode across it was on a rail train when I was working there in 1970. I was in a cab of an F unit. I knew where it was. I'd never seen it, but I knew where it was. So I was like, so we're tooling along with this train of scrap rail heading to Atlanta, and I'm riding in the brakeman seat on this F unit. So I see the bridge coming up, and all of a sudden you're on it. And then you look and you realize the birds are flying beneath you. And you're thinking, oh my God. and you know, I'm not really particularly afraid of heights, but the engine crew, these guys, high vol, no big deal. But I just thought, good Lord, this is like you're flying. It's just like you're flying. You're 300 feet over the center of over that valley. And then you're back to the other side. So, but anyway, the old line through New River managed to stay. They continued to keep that line open for a while, so they ran the passenger train that way to serve the mail route. So, and then eventually, that died away as well. So it's all gone except for the center span of the bridge down at New River. Yeah, it happened about 1950, and it was in conjunction with the development of that lake and that dam. But Burnside was actually a port. On the Kentucky River, and not for ships, but like small draft type boats and things like that. But it was a little port there. But when they built that, the railroad was going to be underwater because it dropped down and then served Burnside and came out the other side. So they. In anticipation of the dam being built and the water level coming up, they built that new double track bridge, which is pretty impressive in its own right. It's just not quite as tall as those others. And that opened about 1950 and replaced the other one. One of the rail tunnels, when the lake is really down, you can get in one of the original tunnels that feeds out onto that, what is now the lake, but the old trestle was pretty impressive, but it's not nearly as much as the new one. I can tell you an anecdote about the New River Bridge.
Yeah.
When I was working there, I spent about 3 or 4 weeks working to inspect track south of Oneida, and we had a high rail truck. And you would have a laborer who would be with me. He was called your crank hand. And he was a great guy. His name was Rex. And you'd have to look for anything that was amiss. Well, I didn't realize it till one day we went across not High Bridge, but New River Bridge. And in the middle of New River Bridge, they had the spirit car had gone through, and they found a defect in one of the rails. Well, what you did is you had a rail changer behind. They would basically take a rail saw, cut that out, and put a splice in with rail fasteners on either side and track bolts, joints, until you could come back and field weld it. So it was there. Lo and behold, we went across through there, and a couple of the track bolts had worked loose. So our job was to stop and tighten those things up. When I stopped, I thought he was going to swallow his tongue. I said, Rex, we need to get this. He said, I can't get out. I said, don't worry, I'll take care of it. So I got out and I thought, good Lord, and watch your step. So I managed to get up there and tighten the bolt, put the bolt back and tighten it up, but he couldn't get out. It was too much for him. But I didn't blame. I understood how he felt. Brosnan made Hunter Harrison look like, the Tooth Fairy. This guy was hell on wheels. He was incredible, but guy was a very innovative, driven personality. There's a 2-volume book that some guy wrote called Brosnan, the Railroad's Messiah. And it's fascinating because when you get back in the days, you can hear hear all kinds of Brosnan stories. I know a lot of Brosnan stories. You know, they were just. He would impulsively fire people for nothing. You know, just fire people. They used to have a big officer rally at Almond, North Carolina. And all the office cars, everything would come in, all these division officials, they had these big tents and barbecue, and they'd have this divisional meeting. Well, they had an agency at Almond, this one guy that ran this agent, you know, the depot there, would get overwhelmed because they knew that Brosnan would be there, and when they would have their meetings, he would quiz them on how their division was operating the previous day. And if they didn't have the information, they were dead. So they were down there, you know, trying to find out, did 122 get through? Was he delayed? So-and-so, you know, if I get grilled on this, I've got to know. So Brosnan went down to the depot himself. And this old guy was over there, and he had stacks of these things. He was trying to send out these messages. And Brosnan said, hey, he said, this depot's cold as ice. He said, you need to build a fire. He looked up and he said, I don't have time to build a fire. Look at these messages I've got to send. I've got a stack of these things. He said, if you got a blank over there, I'm going to send one out. He said, yeah, just write it out there. I'll put it on the stack. He said, to Superintendent Asheville Division, fire the agent in Almond, North Carolina immediately, D.W. Brosnan, President. He tore it off and said, send that out. So, so he came back about 30 minutes later and walked in. The old guy was on his knees with kindling and trying to get this fire going. He said, did you send that message? I ain't got time to send a message. I've got to get a fire building this thing. As a kid, they used to have a car shop in Knoxville, Costner shop. And if Brosnan was coming to town, they'd have all these hopper cars down there that were stencil HR, heavy repair. And you know, he hated, you know, you'd walk in, you'd see the yard full of HR hoppers that hadn't gone through the shop. So to make things look good, they would put them together in a train, and they'd send them up here to Appalachia and shove them up a branch line and hide them when Brosnan was in Knoxville. So I saw them coming in. You know, you'd see a train coming in with about, you know, 60 or 70 old hopper cars with the sides out of them, and they're robbing along, and they'd take them up there and hide them until Brosnan was out of Knoxville, and they'd take them back down there. But he was brilliant. He's a brilliant guy. And there, you know, he figured out ways to make the Southern extremely competitive in a time where railroading in general was in trouble in some places, particularly in the Northeast. But he drove the Southern to be profitable. And then his day came, and he was eased out by the board and replaced by Graham Claytor, which was a good transition. So, D.W. Brosnan. There were two reasons they did that. One was to eliminate the clearance problems, obviously. The other was to reduce gradient and reduce curvature. You know, if you do those things, you're going to increase train velocity. So you have a railroad that can take any dimension load and get it end to end faster, in a more expeditious sort of way. So both of those were reasons they did that. The future is today. You know, I thought I was born a little too late to experience steam, and so my first years I was like, I've just gotten here at the barn and the horse is gone. And then I realized over time that what I was doing unwittingly would be important one day. So the future is today for any young photographer. So what you're doing is far more important than you can grasp. Well, you know, I missed the M1. I was too young to photograph it, but I got these 5 RS3s on this coal train. Wow! And I'm thinking, well, it's just 5 RS3s. That's cool. And then I realized, I said, yeah, I guess it is. I guess it is. So one day that's going to be true. You know, there are going to be some GE Gevos that had just been rebuilt, you know, out of Huntington and fresh paint. and somebody's going to be doing a book one day. If they still have books, they're going to be doing something. It'll be a hologram or something. But to have those images and to have that history, it's important. So what you're doing today is just as important as, in the past. Don't you wish that had been the attitude of some folks along the EK back in the late 40s and early 50s, if they could have gotten out and documented all that train traffic on the L&N. Wish it had happened, but it didn't. So what you're doing now is vitally important. The easiest place is to go to the L&N Historical Society website. We'll be selling them and it'll be discounted, and so you can get them through some of the regular dealers. You can get them directly from the publisher, Garbly Publishing. He has a website, or you can get it from vendors like Ron's Books and other places. But you'll get a great discount. Just you don't have to be a member. Just go to the LNHS, lnhs.org, and they take credit cards, PayPal, library cards, food stamps, whatever you got.
Perfect.
Everything except Bitcoins.
What about scripts? Do they take that?
They take script. I got a good buddy as a script. I've got some script from my grandfather's store in over in eastern Kentucky, at Klutz, Kentucky. Charlie E. Flanary. I've got some script from his store. It's non-negotiable, but I've got it. That's why it's not Appalachia, it's Appalachia.
Yeah, that drives me crazy.
Yeah,
I was a Yankee and I knew how to say it right.
Yeah, it's Appalachia. There are always more sophisticated people elsewhere who may want to say it. Don't go to Stanton, Virginia, and call it Staunton. They won't like it. Don't go to Buena Vista, Virginia, and call it Buena Vista. No, it's Buena Vista. Don't call it Buena Vista.
There you go.
And don't call Dante, Virginia that. It's Daint.
Or it's not Versailles, it's Versailles.
It's Versailles. When I was a youngster, there was a little wide place in the tracks near Pineville, and it was a turnback point for a couple of mine runs. And it was so insignificant. I mean, I don't think anything was there, but they were always calling a mine run when I was a youngster a Markle turn. And I thought, where is Markle? And so as I got inquisitive and looked at timetables, and I realized, oh, it's Miracle. It's Miracle. So I never heard it called Miracle. So I would go to the yard office as a youngster. What time are they calling the Markle turn? I may go down to the road crossing and get a photo of it.
I love that.
Yeah, you have to go with the flow. Go with the flow.
Well, and I've done so much research because you put this video out, and someone that lives in this area sees it, and you say the wrong thing, and on the internet they will immediately call you out. So you gotta get it right.
Oh yeah, you got to. I mean, the internet is it's a world of experts out there. Everybody,
Monday morning quarterback.
Oh yeah, everybody's going to get you straightened out on whatever, and trust me, I deal with them all the time. And sometimes if they're right, I'll just say, okay,
yeah,
okay, well,
move on.
Okay, let's move on to something else.